Everybody, welcome to the iSpring Solutions webinar series, where every week we talk about e-learning trends, share iSpring tips and tricks, and cover clients' cases. My name is Paulina Ionina. I am the community manager at iSpring, and I will be the moderator for today's session. And we have a super interesting topic that we are going to cover today. And what we're going to talk about is engagement, of course. And to cover this webinar's topic, I have invited the one and only Dr. Clark Quinn. Hi, Clark. Very happy to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. How about yourself?
I'm doing wonderful and super excited for today's webinar.
And
So,
thank you all for
Clark,
being here today.
absolutely. So Clark is going to explore the rationale for motivation, necessary elements for building engagement, and a viable framework for hooking and maintaining interest.
So let's begin. I want to ask you, how are you making your experience engaging? Do you have your audiences responding like this with enthusiasm and energy and engaged? Or are they instead bored and uninterested in what's going on? And I was just talking with my daughter about her school experience. She's just graduated from college, is going into a job. And she was recollecting that in school, teachers just presented stuff without helping you understand why it's important. And I think I see too much of that in most of the e-learning. I see it's like, you need to know this, so we're going to give it to you without helping you know why you should care. So that's why I'm talking about today. Make it meaningful. Engagement by design. And as Paulina said, I'm Clark Quinn of Quinnovation. I'm Quinnovator on Twitter. If you have that affliction, one way to see what I'm talking about and up to. A little bit about my background so you understand the strange and twisted way I look at the world and can interpret what I say. I saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate. I designed my own major, and it's been my career ever since. It's taken some strange twists and turns. I went back, got a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science, and that's maintained my focus throughout. How our minds work, how we think, work, and learn, and how we use technology to augment that in effective ways, with particular focus on learning and performance. So that's what you'll see, that bias towards a cognitive view of the world influencing here, interestingly, where I'm talking about emotion. So I'm fascinated with learning experience design because I think it's the next generation of instructional design. To me, it's the elegant integration of learning science and engagement. So I've been involved in learning science for a long time, starting with that PhD in cognitive science, such that with some colleagues, we created the series eLearning Manifesto, appeal for designing e-learning like our minds really learn. I've also been involved in doing engagement. My first job out of college was designing and programming educational games, and that's been a recurrent theme throughout my career. I designed one based on my PhD thesis, and when I started teaching as an academic, I was asked to design a game and reflected on that, and became part of my research and led to this first book. And so that here we're talking about the two elements, learning science and engagement. And to me, that's really about the heart and the mind, putting them together in an effective way. And even in cognitive science, we recognize that the heart is part of the picture. Cognitive science talks about cognitive, affective, and conative. And the cognitive is how you learn, the affective is who you are as a learner, and your conation is your intention to learn. And that's where motivation and anxiety come into play, and they play a big role. Now, as I was starting to write this, I was starting to write a book on learning experience design. And in fact, I've got one coming out myself. And I realized, are there good resources about learning science? And I want to suggest that we have many translators of learning science into practical recommendations. This includes people like Will Thalheimer and Patty Shank and Miriam Nealon and Julie Dirksen. The list goes on. And they've got books and they've got blogs and they've got podcasts and there's more being interviewed. So actually, I think there's a fair amount of good research. The learning science side is relatively well taken care of. So then the question becomes, have we addressed the engagement side well enough? Do we have good guidance? Do we have good principles? And here I want to suggest that we really don't. When I looked around, I don't see a lot. Besides Keller and his ARCS model, he's the only instructional design theorist really looking at the whole emotional side. And I see idiosyncratic points to gamification and stuff, but mostly it's somewhat superficial and frankly, wrong. So we need to provide guidance about engagement. So let me pause and give you a minute here, and I want you to answer this question. Is engagement a worthwhile and important part, and is it the right focus for thinking about how to add the emotional side?
So
Me,
yes, it is. You need to add emotional side. That's how information stays.
I
And
agree.
another
Yes.
another answer is most definitely. I don't want eyes glazed over.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Engagement when it is more than click next. I'm seeing them as well, Paulina. So I will
Perfect.
use the term with a Michael Hill. Definitely. It's very important, but not sure whether it's the right terms. Yes, there's a general agreement that the emotional side is important in helping people see, but the question, is it the right term, somebody asked, and I think that's an important question. So thank you for that. I used to use the term engagement. In fact, you saw that first book was titled Engaging Learning. But I was talking to a colleague and he said, yes, engagement, but, and what he pointed out is that people have suborned the term engagement and used it for what to me are some relatively trivial things like tarting up drill and kill, putting a game show template on it makes it more engaging. Yes, if you have rote knowledge, but that's not really what we mean. And click to see more is just a way to hide more content. That's not really, clicks aren't inherently engaging. There has to be some reason and some motivation. Gamification, adding points, this isn't, to me, sufficient. And all video all the time, well, if we do it in video, everybody's totally engaged. And I want to say that's, and so on. There's a whole bunch of stuff people have done under the rubric of engagement that, to me, is missing the point. It's a little too superficial. It's not truly digging into motivation. It's only superficially doing it. We're using the term extrinsic motivation. So I want to suggest this is not the right approach. And therefore, I've become leery of using the term engagement. And I believe in, emotional involvement and immersion beyond the cognitive. So I was looking for a better term. What could we possibly do? And that's where I came up with this, make it meaningful. In fact, I'd like this to be a mantra for you to think, how do I go beyond just tarting it up and adding points because I can't figure out any way to make it engagement? How do I make it meaningful? So I do want to make a caveat here, and I hinted at this already. When you have rote knowledge that needs to go in the head, turns out tarting it up in with points in the story and stuff works. But we too often think that rote knowledge is going to be the difference we need. And I want to suggest that by and large, what's going to be more beneficial to you and your organizations is going to be the ability to make better decisions, the ability to perform better and follow procedures better, not knowing rote knowledge. So there are times when it's important, like medical vocabulary, we want to have the right term, but by and large, that's not the right solution. So that's why I want to say for everything else, let's go a bit deeper. So the first thing I want to do is say, let's set the hook. And this is a time when I'm going to use the question box again. I want to ask you and top your things into the question box. How do you set the hook? How do you help people become initially willing to engage with your learning experience that you'd like them to persist with? What are you using as a technique? What are the tricks, the tips? And feel free to be honest and admit that you, by and large, don't. That's not the focus. That's not what your bosses expect. That's not what your customers expect. But please do type into the chat. Ask a provocative question, storytelling, use their own interests. Oh, we're getting some great answers here. Start with a question, establish a deficit. They must need it. Identify issues, ask them a question, making sure they know, pose a question, lots of asking a question. Always ask if they have previous knowledge, you have to challenge their prior knowledge. Prepare for the class, and take a quiz prior to the class. Provide the why, Chelsea Auburn says. Graphic organizers. Project enthusiasm, absolutely, your own enthusiasm matters. So there's lots of things you folks are doing here. Usually a funny intro to relax the mind, like I did, yes. Graphics and animation. Great, really great feedback here. Thank you for all the things you're suggesting. Taking time, assessments, and indeed we know cognitively that asking them questions beforehand that they don't know the answer to leads to better retention. But I find it kind of aversive. And I've argued against pre-tests, except for the learner's benefit. So if they can test out of stuff, it's good. So thank you for that. I agree. I think, as was suggested in the answer to the first question and emerged here, the WIFM, what's in it for me? It's really interesting. Will Thalheimer, I mentioned his name before, did a study about objectives, and the objectives we use for design, and we should properly use good Mager style objectives that say they'll be able to perform this to this level in this context. That's great for our design. That's not what we should present to our learners. We need to present objectives that are within what's in it for me. I want to dig a little bit into that. So I have a sort of a three-step process that I think is what's useful to do this. And realize this is the whole today, what we're doing is a very top-level coverage of what actually is quite deep. But at the beginning, the first thing is I need a recognition. I need to know this. If you can get them to go, I do need to know this, not want to know this, not should know this, I need to know this. And you do that through consequences. You do that helping them see, wow, if I don't know this, these things happen. If I do know this, these things can happen. So recognition. And the second thing is, and I don't. Now this most of the time isn't important, but it can be. If they think they know this already, and I've seen this with overconfident learners, particular instance with sales folks, they thought they knew how to go sell a truck, and they were not doing it well. And we had to break down that confidence, show them that they weren't really following the process, they weren't really doing a good job before we could get them opened up to learn. So I need to know this, and I don't. If they are maybe overconfident, you may have to break that down. That's optional. And I trust this experience will deliver. The third component is they have to believe that what you're going to do is going to make a difference. And if you've been beating them over the head with lots of bullet points of information dump that doesn't really enable them, you may have to rebuild some credibility to get them on board with that. So this to me is the necessary steps you have to do to get them upfront to buy in. And this may even be an invitation to the learning experience before you actually do the introduction. You should revisit it perhaps in the introduction, but you want to get them bought in. So it's the what's in it for me with a caveat. If you can't do that, maybe you shouldn't even be trying to do this. And forget compliance. Let me address that just parenthetically in a second. But first, if you don't really have a reason that they should need this, there may be a problem with your motivation to subject them to this. Now, compliance, yes, you have to do it, but I would suggest there's even a reason for compliance, that most of the time when you have compliance, there's some reason why that's been mandated. It's either a risk to the company, it's a risk to the individuals in the company, it may be a risk to yourself. So find that, make that manifest to them. The consequences, what happens if they do know this? What happens if they don't? And oftentimes we do, because now, granted compliance, there's a lot of CUIA, right? Cover your assets. It's done by lawyers so that if you then misbehave, they can go, well, we gave them the training, so if they misbehave, they're a bad person, it's not our company. And as Mark Rosenberg once opined, eventually somebody's going to challenge any legal trouble they get into by saying that that company's compliance training wasn't really effective. But there are real consequences. It could just be time wasted doing things that don't matter, like following misconceptions like learning styles. It could be real money that's lost, either through lawsuits or through malfeasance, because you're not following these appropriate steps. It could actually be lives lost because you're doing the wrong things, you're not being safe. And then there's, other things, reputation, self-esteem. There's a whole bunch of things that can be damaged that don't necessarily map directly to those, but are important. So I want to suggest that helping people see why they need this and making sure that they do, this is something that's going to benefit them and the organization, and making that clear is an important step to actually drawing in the emotional necessity. So I have a proposed heuristic, and I'm going to elaborate on this. If there's either the following, and a vivid personal consequence of knowing this stuff or not knowing this stuff. So either if I don't know this, this bad stuff can happen, or if I do know this, this good stuff can happen. If there's that, or stats with meaningful consequences, as a secondary thing, maybe you can show that there are large damages that may not feel personal, but it's very clear they're societal. If you have those, go with it. If you don't have either of those, back to that issue, maybe this isn't needed. So that's my proposed heuristic. I'm going to go a tiny bit further here, because something you guys all mentioned, I think, or many of you mentioned, was asking questions. What about surprise? I think surprise is really interesting, and there's actually some interesting background about why that's the case. Carl Friston's a neuroscientist, and he was trying to explain what drives us and our learning, and he's proposed that we learn, and it's not unique to him, but he's got the most refined model of it. We learn to minimize surprise. We don't like when there's a large gap between what we expect and what happens, particularly if it's bad. So, that doesn't mean that we want to stay in a dark room and have no surprises. It means that we will learn when the benefit of learning is less than the consequences of the surprise, because then we are better equipped. So surprise is an important motivation, and it can be used to trigger. If there's something that was contrary to our expectations, it can trigger a desire to drive. So my proposed heuristic adds, if there's a surprising answer to a question, and that's what a lot of you ticked into, that's directly relevant, use it. Curiosity is even more powerful than the need if you can get them to a want stage. I want to know the answer to this. It still should be backed up by the need, however, I will suggest. So I hope you're with me so far. We're going to, Plain has suggested it's better with as many people to save answering individual questions till the end of the session, and we will leave time for that. But now, once you've set the hook, how do you keep them on the line? And again, this is a question I want to ask you to pause. Again, let's take a minute and pop our answers into the questions to see, how do you keep them engaged throughout the experience once you've got them initially willing to commit? Because if you suddenly, oh, we're going to make this interesting, and then you dump a bunch of content on them, and you then, do stupid knowledge tests instead of applying that in the ways they'll be applying the learning experience, you're not going to maintain their interest. You've sold them a bill of goods. So how do you keep it meaningful? Continue to surprise them, make them part of the journey Don't try to transfer knowledge, let them discover. Great. I include pop quiz slides, interaction and application to the learner experiences, opportunities to respond and reflect. Definitely ask questions and allow them to ask questions. Pairing them up to getting them to processes. Social is really powerful. In my organization, we don't. Robin, that's why I'm here. Thank you. Show them value, make a difference. Yes, can you be surprised? Practical hands-on, visual images, manipulate the concepts in some way. Some great stuff here. Include a live word cloud that they can congregate with their answers. So you're making them active. You're making them by learning the audience, using their previous stories, responses later in the presentation. That's a good one. Flesh out understanding. So indeed, you're talking about a lot of the techniques we're going to get into. And I'm going to talk about a few here. Oops, I went way too fast. There. So somehow, again, I'm going to suggest it's about making it meaningful to them and getting them engaged and drawing them in and helping them make their own understandings are important. I want to talk, some of that's cognitive, but I want to talk about the emotional side in particular. And this is something I think we don't do enough, is consider the emotional trajectory as we go through the experience. Now, this is purely hypothetical, made up, it's aspirational, not empirical. But the notion is, as we go through the learning experience, and we start with a motivating example, and then we have see the objectives, and then we're presented with the underlying concept or a model, and we're given examples of that model, and then we're given chances to practice. And what I want to consider is our emotional trajectory over this. So I want to suggest that first, if we do that motivating example right, we will indeed get them hooked in. But now we need to maintain that. And what can we consciously do? And we're going to talk about some tips and tricks, but the goal is to think about this explicitly. How do we maintain their motivation through the experience until the end? And the reason we don't need to do it at the end is because we're going to, now they're going to know it. They don't need to be motivated because it's already built. And we need to keep the anxiety low enough. Anxiety, just as motivation helps us learn, anxiety interferes with learning. And if we don't explicitly address it, it can be a severe interference with the ability to achieve our outcomes. So that motivating example may motivate them, but it may also make them anxious about the experience that's going to come through. And we're going to convince them that indeed we believe this, we have designed this experience to develop their ability, but they still could be anxious. And that might diminish as you give them concepts and examples. And if you're explicitly making it safe for them to observe this, practice may raise it again. And how do you keep practice from becoming aversive? How you need to think about making it safe, about allowing failure, having, the instructor can model making mistakes. They can, make jokes and make it comfortable and make it safe. So how do we explicitly manage anxiety and build confidence? What we want learners to do is to gradually build their confidence. Oh, I'm beginning to understand this, the concept. Yes, I see these examples. I get this. Oh, the first practice. I'm a little nervous. But if they have success and they deal with more and more complex problems and successfully eventually complete them, there may be some hiccups, and there may even need to be a requirement that they do eventually perform under stress, because that may be the situation in which they're expected to perform. But make it safe first. And once they've got their confidence and their ability developed, then start adding in the stress. But again, this is hypothetical, but I think we don't think about this enough. And I want to give us the opportunity to do, I want to give you the incentive of the concept, the idea of actually explicitly thinking about this. Now, storytelling was mentioned, and I think it's becomes part of at least designing a meaningful practice, wrapping it in a story. If you indeed, as an experience, you don't wrap an overarching story around the whole experience and embed it that way. And I want to talk about story. I want to talk about 3 elements that to me are critical to make successful story. And there's good guides to storytelling. Rand Screen's got his instructional story instructional story design. I'm looking it up on the shelf. Yeah, instructional story design, where he goes through, writing stories. But to me, it's critical. The first thing you have to do is have a goal, the goal that the learner needs to achieve. And that's driven by what they have to learn to do. What they have to do in the practice has to align with what they have to do outside of the learning experience and performance. So that will constrain what you do, but then you want to put them in, and the challenge around this, the goal, if you look at the dramatic behavior in movies and in books and in games, you have this building of tension that it gets more and more challenging, and then you get a little relaxed with a chance to reflect, a break, and then it gets more challenging. Ultimately, you have the final challenge, and then you have the denouement. But this actually maps to learning in an important way that we want. Our challenge will build as we start from the problems that they can solve as beginners to the final problems they need to be able to solve to demonstrate that they finally achieved the outcome. So we're having this built in if we pick the appropriate goals and develop them through the course of the experience. The second thing is the role they play. So goal and role. What role do they play to achieve this goal? And we can play with this in interesting ways. They might just be a practitioner, but why not make them some sort of operator, or they may be a consultant on it, so they have to face multiple different problems. They may be a manager, but make them a ruler. We can embed this in a fantasy, because the third thing, although before I go to that third thing, I will mention Henry Jenkins had a really nice heuristic here about the role. Put the player in a role they would like to be in. And that's true for game design, but it's also true for learning game design. Have them in a role that they recognize as somebody that would be doing this, but it's an interesting role to play. And in fact, here's the quote: choose a role that the player would want to be in, Henry Jenkins. As a heuristic, but it's, I think, one of the more insightful guidances I've seen about design. And I've done a lot of game design. Finally, there's the world you put them in. And some people believe it has to be realistic. If you're doing near transfer, I believe that's true. You should do it as close as possible. But if you're doing far transfer, if you're teaching skills that have an application in multiple domains, like negotiation or planning, you might want to set it in a fantastic world to facilitate that abstraction and transfer. And I'm unfortunately not the only person who says this. I asked colleague Carl Koch, who's one of our great experts on doing games for learning, and he concurred that indeed a fantasy setting often can make sense. So, and there's lots of ways we can do this. It can be set in the Wild West, it can be set in outer space, it can be set in medieval times, or it can just be in a slightly twisted version of the real world where things are a little bit out of whack with the real world, and we'll talk about that just briefly. So, tips and tricks. Last time I'm going to ask you for some help here. And you already gave some fabulous ones, but how can you what tips and tricks do you have to keep them engaged? And you mentioned a number of things like getting them to break out and do social interactions. I forget the improved version. I came up with my own, and then I realized it was a well-established thing where you think first your own, and then you pair and share. There was a term for that, and I can't remember. But what else? You were talking about continuing to do pop quizzes, continue to challenge their concepts. What other tips and tricks do you have when you do this? Role play? Yes, Laura, that's a great one. Games, storytelling, yes, indeed. Real world scenarios can help, particularly telling really riveting examples. Micro learning. There's two interpretations of that, whether it means spacing it out over time or whether you mean performance sport. In this case, I think you mean spacing out, which indeed can help. Certainly helps cognitively. Interesting to think about it in the terms of maintaining engagement. Fast pacing, yes. Make it personal. Indeed, cognitively, you want them to link it to their own experience, but that also can be engaging as well. Problem-based learning, yes, giving them challenges. Post-learning assignments, indeed. That's, again, important cognitively, but we also want to look at the engagement. Report out group work, yes. Having them solve problems and then bring that back is really important. It's meaningful practice, and it's also engaging, particularly if you make an interesting scenario that they're having to solve, wrap a good story around it. Exploratory learning, Klaxon. I don't know what that is. I'll have to look it up. Online conversations, yes, if you're doing it virtually, having breakouts. Or you can ask people to give suggestions in your webinar about the tricks and tips they use. Peer teaching, that can be really good. And in fact, that's cognitive apprenticeship talked about reciprocal teaching, which is cognitive apprenticeship is my favorite model for learning. KWL, again, another thing I am not familiar with. So, but great stuff. And once again, I've gone too far because I use my mouse instead of using my keyboard. So I'm going to talk about some of the tips and tricks I've accumulated over the years in thinking about this. And the first one is exaggeration. Now, this is a beautiful little European street, but they clearly have done something with a color filter. And I use it to emphasize my point that if you look at movies and novels and games, the stress level that they embody to make it more dramatic tends to be an exaggeration one level above what the real world has. And the interesting thing here is that it can't be too far, but it's also still relevant to the world. So if you set it in outer space, that's already exaggerated from the real world. But within that setting, you want to be consistent with that setting, and you want to take it one level of exaggeration of stress, things happening more frequently than they do in the real world, or the consequences are a little bit more important. So don't just work on the ambassador's daughter. I mean, work on a regular patient, work on the ambassador's daughter or the rebel leader's daughter. Don't just do a deal. Have them do the deal that's going to save the company, exaggerating it just a bit, because in the real world, there will be real consequences to their choices. In the learning world, there's not that immediacy. So if you ramp up the exaggeration, you're getting closer to the motivation, the conditions under which they'll be performing in the real world. Humor. Humor works. You have to be careful. Humor is difficult to do. Some tricks about it are, one of the things is cultural differences in humor. But if you're talking about the workplace, everybody's sharing a workplace. Workplace humor can work. You don't want to have it right in the core of the practice. It can be a little relaxation. So if you have an ongoing scenario, you might have an odd little bit at a point where you've gotten into a weird branch. But in general, bookending to open up, and that helps address the anxiety. And as to support reflection afterwards, positive affect does make you search broader. So it's a better learning environment unless you need people to go deep. When you're stressed, you tend to do more of the same thing. But if you need that to happen, you can use it. But in general, we want people to be going broad thinking. So do think about using humor explicitly. Bad jokes. I make bad jokes all the time. Just ask my wife. So the point being, don't overwhelm it, but lightly use humor at the right time, and appropriate humor, particularly humor that brings out facets of what we're doing, not that is totally irrelevant, is important as well. So there are nuances doing humor well, but humor, it can help. Cutting it down, minimalism is really important as well. We need to set the stage. We need to help tell the story, but doing that as minimal as possible. We know that overloading our cognitive resources with gratuitous images, gratuitous noises, gratuitous stuff can overwhelm our cognitive resources and keep, and this is the cognitive load issue, which carries over to our engagement. We don't want to overdo it so that we overwhelm people's ability to focus on the actual practice they need to be doing. So we want to set the stage. We want to do what's necessary to make it authentic, and then other than that, do it minimally so that we're not going too far. And another one that's really important is doing this, and I got this from Deb Todd, who's a game designer and a movie script writer. She's been deeply involved in these things. And I was working on a project with her, and she said one of her key criterion, and she used this again and again as we were developing this, it has to be organic. What happens has to come naturally in the setting you have established. If there's a jarring break, it can overwhelm it. They're a master. Okay, so Mel Brooks can break out of his Western into this movie set on which it's happened, but he's a master and you shouldn't try this in your own home. But seriously, even then, it's consistent because they are filmed on movie sets. He didn't go suddenly into outer space. That's hard to manage. So keep it organic. And that's, again, a heuristic, like put the player in a role they'd like to be in, but heuristics are part of our tips and tricks. So that's a technique we can use to keep ourselves on track. Again, we want to make it meaningful. And I'm encouraging you, as you sit down to design going forward, stop and say, make it meaningful. What do I need to do? How can I make it meaningful? You will get better learning outcomes, and your learners will be grateful if you invest this effort in thinking of this. So how do we make this happen? How do we bake engagement into what we do? How do we make it systematic? How do we do this properly? You need a process. And this is a very coarse overview of the process that I've created to represent. So you take your regular process and you're going to do your performance consulting because you need a meaningful objective. It's got to be meaningful to the learner in two ways. When you make it meaningful, the first thing is it has to be meaningful to them. They have to get it, but it also has to be a meaningful goal for the organization, and they will get that as well. And in fact, when I created my original alignment that led to the Engaging Learning book, the EEA alignment, that's when the elements of effective education practice and the elements of an engaging experience actually align perfectly. And in it, there were two types of meaningful for each of those. And one is that it's real meaningful skill that you're acquiring and that you are made to care about that skill. You know you need it. And so that the making sure that it's a real meaningful thing comes from performance consulting and creating an objective, because that objective guides you making an important practice and creating a story around that practice. But the goal comes from good objectives and from your subject matter experts. You'll need models, but misconceptions are a really important component, and getting good stories from them and finding the intrinsic interest. Here's the aspect. They have spent years becoming experts in this. What made that so fascinating for them? If you can tap into that, you have a real advantage. You also want to set metrics that used to be that you should be setting metrics that say, how will I determine that this has been an effective education experience? You might use the Kirkpatrick model or Thalheimer's improvement, the ELTA model. But now you also want to set metrics for engagement. You're going to want to tester that. You're also going to want to find the learner's interest, as was pointed out in the chat questions. And you're going to pull it together. You should just, after getting the objectives, you should design the practice first. Then, and you want to, the misconceptions give you the challenge because they provide good alternatives to the right answer. So you can embed those in and address them before they may get it wrong in the learning experience. Those consequences from stories get made into the consequences in the practice story. And then you're going to have examples that are stories as well. And you're going to have an intro and closing. The intro will help motivate that with them, and you're going to want to emotionally close the experience as well. And because engagement is an affective thing, is a subjective thing, is the personal experience, you're going to have to test it and tune it. You will make good guesses to begin with, but to truly get a working experience that is effective educationally and is also engaging, you can't just put game designers and instructional designers room together and immediately they'll come up with something. You're going to get chocolate covered broccoli or something. It's not good. So expect and build into your process that you're going to have to test it and tune it. And that's why people like Kathy Moore with her action mapping, Michael Allen with his SAM model, and David Merrill with his Pebble in a Pond, they're beginning to talk about building iteration into your process, which also means building it into your schedule. And having prototypes and testing early and often are important components. So that to me is how you make it meaningful. And I implore you, please do. This is why I'm here. This is what I think is missing as much as the learning science is also And learning science points to this being important as well, but I'm separating out because it's sort of the brain and the heart, right? The heart and the mind, the cognitive and the emotional. Please make it meaningful. That's what I wanted to talk to you today about. And at this point, I want to open it up to the questions that have been accumulating in the thing. I hope Polina will weigh in and let me know the questions that she's seen come across that are important and prioritize them. I will say two other things. First, things that end up in books and presentations like this tend to show up on my blog, learnthis.com. If you need help sleeping at night, great place to go. There are sites for the books. I'm actually going to put them all at Quinnovation. I've put them all at the Quinnovation site as well. And the other thing is, thank you so much for taking the time to hear this. I hope you found it worthwhile. And I now welcome your questions. Polina?
Thank you so much, Clark. That's been a pleasure to have you for our today's webinar. And yes, we are ready to start our Q&A session. All right. So question. How to measure the motivation level?
Indeed, that's a challenging one. And the interesting thing is you can do it objectively. You can measure people's galvanic skin response, and they've done this. You could actually measure the adrenaline level in the blood if you wanted to be that invasive. I don't think you need to. I think engagement is a subjective experience. You can just ask people, and ask a good question. Is this better than having your teeth pulled without anesthesia? Or is this better than the other ways we've been doing it? Or would you pay money for this? There's a whole level of questions, but make sure you ask it in a way that helps you distinguish, is this engaging? You can also, look at their eagerness to do more. You can look at their activity level in the session. Are they participating more? Are they clicking on more? Are they really engaged in the practice? But seriously, it's a subjective thing, and just asking them in meaningful ways is as good a way as any.
And we have another question that I think sort of comes along with the previous one. What's the best way of measuring whether you've been successful in terms of making it meaningful? Are there particular barriers, for example, asking for feedback immediately before they've reflected?
Well, if you put the WIFM up front in an invitation to learn, so you're now explaining why this is important. And again, that's what I see too often. I even saw somebody who knew better. He showed me a syllabus, and I go, you're telling them all this stuff they're going to learn, and it's important stuff, but you haven't told them why it's important. And so if you're in your invitation, you make it clear why this is important. Does that lead to an increase in people signing up for the course? I think right there is an interesting and important metric. But again, you can do two things. You can look at their patterns of behavior and look for evidence of increased engagement, or you can ask them whether this makes it sound more important. Both of those are useful.
Thank you very much for covering that. And another question from Jody. Can anxiety be alleviated at the outset when we offer the groundwork for the course?
It can be. It's not completely the total answer, but you definitely should make clear your rules about the behavior you're going to expect, that you're going to expect people to comment on ideas and not on people, that you're going to personally, say mistakes are okay. You also show that in, a syllabus or whatever you set up front that says, we're going to be giving you a bunch of practice that's not evaluated because we want you to have the chance to get it right. A whole bunch of the policies you set can relieve anxiety. And if you make those clear up front, you're going to at least have the promise that they shouldn't be anxious. Then you have to manifest it throughout the course and indeed make it safe and have the, again, the instructor making their own mistakes. And that actually cognitively is really important from the work of Alan Schoenfeld, where he would work through a problem and make a mistake, and then he's talking through it, and he'd work back and figure out where he went wrong, and then he'd go down the right path. But showing that monitoring process actually is really good for learners as well, and again, that makes it safe too.
Perfect. Thank you very much for covering. Next one from Robin. In instructor-led courses, how does a designer compensate for instructors that are really not good presenters? In my experience, it seems to affect the learning experience significantly.
I agree. If presenters aren't good presenters, you have one or two options. You either train them to be a good presenter, or you don't let them present. um, because I agree, having a presenter. Now, the thing is, we should be shifting from information presentation from people, except perhaps telling stories, to being learning facilitators. So presenting information, it is increasingly not the model I'd advocate. But if they're not able, there's a couple things that are really important in instructors. And one is, and this comes from work with subject matter experts trying to develop content, and confirmed this with several colleagues who do this really well and really a lot. Not every expert is capable of articulating the model that goes underneath it. Not every expert is truly understands it in practice as well as in theory. I recommend triangulating when you're developing your content, not just getting the expert in theory, but somebody who oversees the actual performance of people and says, where do they really go wrong? And you want to bake that into the learning experience. But then what you need from instructors, they have to be able to articulate the models and connect it, and they have to be enthusiastic and care about the topic. And the enthusiastic and care about the topic, if they truly do, they may need help being shown how to manifest that. And if they're not able to communicate, you may give them better models. But if you can't address both of those, get somebody else to do the presentation who can. Um, that's I realize that's not always ideal or always possible, but that's the direction I would push.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing. Another question that we have. How about if your audience asks for all positive things? They don't want to hear anything negative, then how to challenge them?
Um, that's a matter to me of setting the expectations of the audience. And one of the things I've learned is explaining your pedagogy really removes sessions. The first time I ran my game design workshop, I used an example that to me it was about project management, but it was very generic because the topic was project management. It was for non-project managers. So I chose a topic that was very generic, and B, I knew deeply, and C, I had an example that I could use going along. But I didn't explain. I just heard them working on this topic. And at the end of the workshop, they'd marked me up and said, oh, well, we don't like, we didn't know why we did this. We wanted to do that. So the next time I ran the workshop, I simply explained before I started with this example, this is why I'm using this one. Complaints went away. You need to make your pedagogy clear. This helps learners become self-improving learners because they can internalize it and then apply it to their own self-learning going forward. But the other thing is that you need to explain to them why they need to see some negative examples. You can use the space of design. You will transfer to all the spaces you've seen. If I don't give you negative examples, you may over transfer to inappropriate places. So I need to show you some negative, and I need to tell you some negative stories so you see those as well. Negative consequences, motivating. Learning isn't just fun, and that's one of the important points in a quote Seymour Papert said originally. Learning should be hard fun. And if you look at the flow model of Csikszentmihalyi, it lines right up with the learning model of Vygotsky, that there's this stuff that's too difficult for you is frustrating and no learning happens. The stuff that's too easy is boring and no learning happens. In between, at the right level of challenge where learning happens, there has to be some challenge. And that's a really important point to help them understand that you are doing this as the most effective way to learning, and just having a positive and pleasant isn't going to lead to the best outcomes. And I think helping them understand, educating them about education is, I think, an important component.
Never hurts, that's for sure. Another question that we have, I see that you have lots of the books displayed right now on the slide, but are there any other books that you would recommend to learn more about your theories and making things meaningful?
That's why I am doing this, and I'm writing something as right now it's in process. Keller's ARCS model is, he did write a book about it. It's a bit academic, but it's empirically based. His ARCS model, by the way, is you need to gain and maintain learners' attention. That's the A, attention. Relevance, and I talked about that, needs to be relevant to the learner and to the real domain. ARC. C, confidence. You want to build and maintain their confidence. They need to have confidence that the learning experience is going to effectively address the issue, and you want to build their confidence in their ability to perform. And satisfaction, they need to afterwards to be satisfied with the experience, and again, that's a subjective exposure. So that's one. Brent Jones for academic life has the music model that's about attention. I can't remember what its acronym stands for, but those are a couple pointers. Carl Kopp has talked about designing games as well. So has the other Clark Aldrich. Those are some of the best pointers. Julie Dirksen is beginning to talk about motivation as well recently, and I do recommend, it helped me understand, Matt Richter studied with DC and Ryan and their self-determination theory, and that actually is a really useful model as well to help understand thinking about what are drivers for people to be engaged and perform. And Matt had a simplified version of that model that I've used in that I'm using going forward. There's a workshop I've developed for this that I'm still bringing to market. But so though, I hope that's a exhaustive enough list to get you started.
Thank you so much. Do you have maybe another couple minutes? There are two more questions that I would like to address to you and then wrap up the session.
Sure, I can stick around briefly.
Perfect. So Steve is curious, what tips do you have to teach across various cultural backgrounds? I have to create content for US, Europe, Japan, and Korea.
Right. When I taught, I was an academic for a while in my strange and twisted career, and I took a course on multicultural learning. And the takeaway was use the best learning approach. So I was teaching in Australia, and we had a lot of Asian students, and there was this myth that they could only learn by rote. And that's wrong. Their culture venerates scholarship, and the way you respect your teachers is reciting back what they've told you. But that doesn't mean they're incapable of learning in other ways. So use the best learning design, and that includes meaningful practice and feedback and models and examples, the elements that I had in my process diagram. But don't expect them to be able to know how to learn this way if they're not used to active problem-based learning. They may need scaffolding into it. If they're not used to trying to work on group projects, they may struggle to do this. So provide support. Use the best learning design, provide support for different cultures and how to learn in this way, and use cross-cultural references. If you're doing this for all these different countries, you're doing it for a bunch of different people, but maybe for the same organization. So you use your organizational touch points as a reference. I hope that helps, Steve.
Perfect. Thank you. And the last question for today, how can I make asynchronous online learning materials engaging to students? How can I increase the likelihood that they will finish reading online module contents?
You can't guarantee that people will consume content unless you make it meaningful. So don't make it, strip it down to the bare minimum and then make them use that. I try and believe a curriculum should be content. I believe a curriculum should be a series of activities that drives them to the content. So give them a problem to solve that requires going to that content to really understand the nuances. In the sample workplace of the future demo I did with Learnovators, the content references, we didn't present content up front. We dropped you into scenarios and made the content available as a click to view button at the bottom. So it's, try and flip that in that sense, that make that content meaningful. And then they'll go, oh, I do need this. Let me go take a look at it. Make it as meaningful as possible and then drive them to it through activities that require it, as opposed to trying to force it to do it. There are other tips to, there's some fabulous tips to make webinars, live virtual experiences meaningful. be enthusiastic, give them chances to apply the problem and come back and report back. All these things that, are active learning makes the learning more effective and more engaging.
Actually, I would like to read that comment out loud from John. Thank you, Clark. Your presentation was as informative as it was inspirational.
I appreciate hearing that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. All right, yes, let's wrap up this super valuable 60 minutes. And hopefully, after this webinar, you folks will be able to go and create some really meaningful, that's engagement content for your learners. And thanks to you, Clark. It was a pleasure having you as our guest presenter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing and say say hello to Polina one more time and goodbye to everybody. And we'll see you.
Yeah, see you. See you at the next
See you.
webinar, everybody.
Yeah, when we can see one another again. Bye-bye.
Exactly. Everyone has a lovely day and bye bye.